There is a verse in Ephesians that most people read past without stopping, and it is the closest thing the Bible gives to an org chart for hell. Paul writes that the real fight was never against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against powers, against the cosmic authorities of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. 4 separate ranks, named in a single breath, and almost nobody in a modern pew could tell you what any of them mean or how they are ordered. Tonight we are going to build that hierarchy from the ground up, using nothing but Scripture and the oldest Jewish traditions that Scripture grew out of, and by the end you will understand why the writers of the Bible were far more afraid of order than they were of chaos. Demons in the Bible were never a formless swarm. They had a chain of command. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Chapter 1. The Rebellion Before the Flood. Every hierarchy needs a founding crime. And this one begins in Genesis 6, in 4 verses so strange that entire church traditions have spent centuries trying to explain them away. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. That is the whole account in Genesis. It does not linger. It does not explain who these sons of God were. It simply reports a marriage between something divine and something human. And then, almost as an afterthought, mentions that the offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, men of renown. For centuries this was treated as a throwaway line. Then scholars went back to the older Jewish material standing behind it, the Book of Enoch, and found the story that Genesis compresses into 2 sentences told in enormous detail. 200 angels, called the Watchers, descend on Mount Hermon and bind themselves by oath to carry out a plan together, so that no single one of them can back out and leave the others exposed. They take human wives. They father a race of giants who grow so large and so hungry that they begin devouring the food of ordinary humans. And when that runs out, they turn on humanity itself. This is not a metaphor for lust. In the earliest Jewish reading, this is a literal invasion of the created order, angels crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross, and the giants are the first evidence on earth that heaven has a rebellion problem. What makes this the foundation of the whole hierarchy is what happens next. The Watchers do not just breed, they teach. One of them, whose name will matter enormously in a moment, begins handing down forbidden knowledge, the kind of information that was supposed to stay locked in heaven. Metallurgy and weapon-making, cosmetics and seduction, astrology, root-cutting, and the interpretation of omens. In other words, the first demons in the biblical tradition are not monsters clawing up from underground. They are teachers. They corrupt the world not with claws, but with curricula, and that detail alone should reframe how you think about temptation in every later story in the Bible. The pattern is set here at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Corruption arrives first as instruction, not as violence. Chapter 2. Azazel and the rank of the fallen leaders. Every rebellion needs a name people are willing to say out loud, and in this tradition that name is Azazel. He is singled out from the 200 Watchers as the chief instigator, the one who taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, and who taught women the art of deceiving with jewelry and cosmetics. In the Enochic account, when God finally moves to judge the Watchers, Azazel receives a punishment unlike any of the others. He is bound hand and foot, thrown into a pit in the desert, covered with sharp rocks, and left in total darkness until the day of judgment, when he will be cast into fire. This is not incidental. This is the origin of the scapegoat ritual you find in Leviticus 16, where the high priest lays the sins of Israel on a goat and sends it out into the wilderness, to Azazel by name in the Hebrew text itself. The most important atonement ritual in the entire Torah is, on the plain reading of the Hebrew, addressed directly to a specific fallen entity in the desert. That is how seriously the biblical world took this hierarchy. They did not just tell stories about it, they built their liturgy around it. Azazel represents the second rank of this structure, not the rank-and-file watchers, but the instigating leadership, the ones who organize corruption rather than merely commit it. Beneath Azazel, tradition places another leader, Shemihaza, who led the oath on Hermon in the first place, and who is condemned to watch his own sons, the giants, destroy each other in endless warfare before he too faces judgment. What the Bible and its surrounding literature are building here is not a flat crowd of evil spirits. It is a command structure with an instigator, lieutenants, and a rank and file, and every level answers for a different kind of crime. This is the part almost no modern retelling of biblical demons gets right. The Bible's underworld has middle management. Chapter 3, the 4 ranks Paul actually named. Return now to that verse in Ephesians, because this is where the New Testament stops being vague and starts sounding almost bureaucratic. Paul names 4 tiers, and each Greek word carries a specific meaning that gets flattened in most English translations. The first is archai, rulers or origins, a term used elsewhere in Greek political writing for the founding magistrates of a city, the ones who set precedent for everyone under them. The second is exousiai, powers or authorities, a word Paul uses everywhere else in his letters for legitimate governing authority, meaning these entities hold something like delegated jurisdiction rather than raw force. The third is cosmokratores, literally world rulers, a term found almost nowhere else in Greek literature except in magical papyri describing planetary spirits believed to govern fate itself. The fourth is simply spiritual forces of wickedness positioned in the heavenly places, meaning Paul locates the lowest visible rank of this hierarchy as operating in the same sky Enoch had already mapped out floor by floor generations earlier. Notice what this ordering does. It moves from the most abstract foundational authority down to forces operating in immediate contact with human affairs, the mirror image of a royal court, where the highest office holds the least direct daily contact with ordinary people and the lowest officials do all the enforcement. Paul is not inventing a new cosmology out of nothing. He is using a vocabulary his readers in Ephesus, a city famous across the ancient world for its magical texts and occult reputation, would have instantly recognized. He takes their existing map of unseen powers and simply reorients the whole structure underneath the authority of Christ, telling a congregation living inside one of the most magic-obsessed cities in the empire that every rank in that hierarchy, no matter how ancient or entrenched, answers to something higher still. That reframing was the actual point of the passage, and it gets lost the moment you read it only as a spooky list. Chapter 4. The names Scripture actually gives you. A hierarchy is not abstract for long. Scripture eventually puts names and even titles on individual entities, and each one tells you something about how ancient Israel actually understood evil. Start with Beelzebub, a name the Gospels put directly in the mouths of religious leaders, accusing Jesus of casting out demons by the ruler of the demons himself. The name almost certainly descends from Baal-zebub, a Philistine title mocked in 2 Kings as Lord of the Flies, a deliberate corruption of an older, more dignified title, Baal-zebul, Prince Baal. This is a pattern worth sitting with. Several of the Bible's demon names are not original inventions of evil at all. They are the gods of Israel's neighbors, deliberately demoted, mocked, and repurposed as subordinate evil spirits, once the biblical authors had committed to the position that their own God alone was real and supreme. Israel did not just reject the gods of Canaan and Philistia. It filed them by name into the lower ranks of its own spiritual hierarchy. Then there is Asmodeus, named explicitly in the book of Tobit, as the demon who kills each of Sarah's 7 husbands on their wedding night before the marriage can be consummated, until the angel Raphael instructs Tobias to burn the heart and liver of a fish, whose smoke drives Asmodeus away to be bound in Egypt. This is one of the few places in the biblical canon where a demon is not just named but given a specific method of defeat, a piece of practical spiritual technology rather than pure theology, and it shows a hierarchy that operates by rules, not just by fear. Bind the right entity in the right way, and the threat ends. Then there is Legion, the unnamed man in the tombs of the Gerasenes, possessed by a force so numerous it answers Jesus with the words, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This is the moment the hierarchy stops being described from a distance and becomes something with teeth, an occupying force organized in explicitly military language, thousands strong, capable of overpowering chains and driving a man to live naked among graves, cutting himself with stones. When Jesus casts them into a herd of 2,000 pigs and sends them over a cliff into the sea, the text is not simply describing a healing, it is staging a demonstration of rank, one authority overriding an entire battalion of another, in full view of a terrified crowd, so that the story functions as a public statement about which hierarchy actually holds the final word. Chapter 5. The king who claimed he could bind them all. No figure looms larger over the later imagination of a structured demonic hierarchy than Solomon, and it is worth being honest about where this material actually comes from. The Hebrew Bible credits Solomon with unmatched wisdom, and, in 1 Kings, hints that his wisdom extended to matters no other king possessed. But the elaborate legend of Solomon, commanding a court of 72 named demons, each with a rank, a title, and a specific area of expertise, comes from a much later text, the Testament of Solomon, likely written centuries after Solomon's death and never accepted into any biblical canon. In that account, Solomon receives a magical ring from the archangel Michael, which allows him to summon and interrogate demon after demon, forcing each one to state its name, the harm it causes, and the specific angel with authority to restrain it before putting it to forced labor building the temple in Jerusalem. The reason this text matters, even though it is non-canonical, is that it shows how deeply the biblical hierarchy of principalities, powers, and named entities settled into the popular imagination once it left Scripture proper. Every demon in that later legend has a superior. Every superior has a weakness. Every weakness maps to a specific virtue, a specific angel, or a specific verse of Scripture recited against it. It is essentially a completed org chart, drawn centuries after Paul left the outline in Ephesians unfinished on purpose, filling in every box the New Testament had left deliberately vague. Whether or not you take the Testament of Solomon as history, it is proof of something the whole hierarchy has been pointing at from Genesis onward. This tradition has never treated evil as chaos. It has always treated evil as an institution, with paperwork, with jurisdiction, and, crucially, with a chain of command that terminates somewhere above it. What this hierarchy was actually built to say: step back from all 5 layers, the Watchers, Azazel, Paul's 4 ranks, the named demons, and Solomon's court, and a single idea holds every piece of it together. None of these texts were written to frighten people with an unbeatable enemy. They were written by communities living under real empires, real famine, real violence, who needed a way to say that the forces working against them were neither random nor final. A hierarchy can be outranked. A named thing can be bound. A rebellion with an origin story has an ending written into it from the start. That is the actual message underneath every one of these terrifying entities. Naming the darkness in this much detail was never really about the darkness. It was about insisting, floor by floor, rank by rank, that something still stood above all of it. So here is the question I want you sitting with when this ends. Of everything in this hierarchy, the fallen watchers who taught first and only turned violent later, Azazel bound alone in the desert while his crimes were formally handed a name in the Torah's holiest ritual, or Legion answering Christ by giving up its own number. Which one of these tells you the most about how the people who wrote the Bible actually understood evil, not as a monster, but as a structure? Put your answer in the comments, because next time we go one level deeper and put a face on the single most famous name this hierarchy ever produced.